Now, today, the people of Leigh-on-Sea and many across Britain are remembering long-serving Conservative MP Sir David Amess, 3 years on from his tragic murder. Amess was fatally stabbed during a constituency surgery by an Islamic State terrorist in 2021. A memorial service has taken place in Leigh this morning as the local community continue to commemorate his magnificent life. But on this important day, I want to ask, amid continued death threats against politicians such as Nigel Farage, are they really safe from history repeating itself? Have we learned nothing from that fateful day 3 years on? I'm joined in the studio by the Reform UK for MP for Ashfield, Lee Anderson. Lee, let's begin if we can. I know when you were in the Conservative Party, David Amess was a colleague and somebody you held in high regard.
Yeah, not just me, Martin. I think everybody in Parliament. He was a gentleman, he was a gentle soul, and somebody who was respected throughout Parliament from, people on the whole spectrum of politics. Just a decent guy, in the job for the right reasons, and always there to help people, especially us newbies.
And when that chilling moment came, the details were absolutely almost too much to comprehend. An ordinary parliamentarian revelling in what you do day in, day out, having face-to-face meetings with constituents. And, of course, with that comes risk. And Sir David Amess paid the ultimate price that day when a crazed Islamist stabbed him to death.
Yeah, a gentle soul. Not a man of very slight stature. Would not have been expecting this. Just nice to everybody. I doubt very much if David could have fought anybody off, to be honest. He was that sort of guy. And when the news broke, I can remember when the news broke on that day, we was just in complete shock that this gentleman, this great parliamentarian, this lovely bloke had been attacked viciously in this way. And it makes you wonder, Martin, we always worried about our own safety. We never think it's going to happen to us, but it really woke us up, that did.
And I think at that point, Lee, a lot of us began asking a lot of questions about the safety of parliamentarians, the state of Britain, the hatred that seems to fester within British society. And, of course, that brings us on to the present day. And we saw just yesterday on this show Nigel Farage talking about this guy, this nutter, over, we think, still in France. I spoke to one of Nigel's advisors just before the show. He's claiming that he's in Britain. This guy with an AK-47, a machine gun tattooed on his face, issuing a chilling death threat to Nigel Farage yesterday. It seems we could have history repeating itself.
Yeah, he's quite clearly, Martin, one disturbed individual, this creature is. I've seen some of the TikTok videos he's been making. Basically, he's taking the mick, he's laughing at us. It wouldn't surprise me, actually, Martin, if he was in this country right now. I suppose we'll find out towards the end of the day where this bloke is, but it's very scary. I speak to Nigel nearly every day, as you're probably aware. He is genuinely concerned for his safety. You've seen the security he has to have around him. What sort of country we're living in, Martin, where we have to have extra security men to protect our politicians. Now, I'll just say this. I was talking to an Iraqi gentleman just a few weeks back who made the journey here, and he could not believe that, MPs like myself were just walking around town on their own with no security. Back in his own country, he says a member of their parliament would not feel safe to walk around their community. And you know what? Sadly, it's getting like that from our own MPs. It's a shocker.
The individual in question, this Madder Papa, he calls himself, if he is in Britain or if he did come to Britain, would be in this extraordinary situation that he's an Afghan, he's an illegal, he's wanted allegedly for crimes in Sweden. He then came through Germany, he then came through France. If this individual got to France, Britain, beg your pardon, if he's actually in Britain, Lee Anderson, we couldn't get rid of him. We couldn't deport him because sending him back to Afghanistan, which of course is ruled by the Taliban, would infringe his human rights. We've lost the plot.
Well, this is what happens, Marty, when you've had successive weak governments who are not prepared to protect our borders and put the safety of British people first. This creature, once he lands on our shores, he should be quickly arrested and deported the same day. And you know what? If he gets these lefty lawyers involved, if he gets his, claims human rights or anything like this, so what? Get rid of this creature. I do not want him in this country, and neither does the vast majority of decent British citizens.
And yet, on Nigel's show last night, I had a conversation, an argument with the human rights lawyer who said, no, what we've got to do is get this guy to Britain and incarcerate him He's our concern. Why should
No.
taxpayers like you or I, any of your constituents, foot the prison bill for this bloke?
He should be on the first flight out of here to Afghanistan and take that lefty lawyer with him, mate. You know, this is part of the problem. They're making absolute fortunes, loads of money out of these people coming over here, abusing our asylum system.
Now, Lee, you're a tough bloke, but, you know, you get threats yourself. Tell us about some of the vile garbage you've been subjected to.
Well, I've had 2 go to court in the last year, threatening to kill me. I've got another one with the CPS. The Met Police took a statement from me last week. This is the thing, Martin. As MPs, we're out and about in the community. We're out on public transport in London, walking to work from our digs. And people will come up to you almost every few minutes and put their hand out. Is it Lee? Is it Lee Anderson? Blah, blah, blah. The vast majority are decent people, just want to have a selfie, shake your hand, say something. Some might want to have an argument with you. That's fair enough. I can put up with that. But you never know. In the back of your mind, you're always thinking, is this the one who's going to attack me or have a go at me and physically assault me? So, yeah, the vast majority are decent and nice and whatever, but it's always in the back of your mind, is this the one who's going to pull something out from under his coat and have a go at me? It's quite scary.
Now, Lee, we seem to be in a position that MI5 announced last week 75% of the threats that we face in Britain are still Islamist terror threats. That seems to have been a constant. And by the way, they've also been targeting Labour parliamentarians, the pro-Palestine brigade. It's not just people from the so-called right wing. As well as that, do you think there's some culpability, as we've seen in America with Donald Trump, with the media whipping up a constant frenzy? For example, Nigel Farage is constantly attacked by the liberal media. He says quite often now it's getting dangerous. Is there a feeling that if you're on the political right, it doesn't matter, your feelings don't matter, and you deserve all you get? Yeah,
I think we saw this early in the week, Martin, with Donald Trump, another supposedly assassination attempt, hardly been covered by their media in the US. It's as if they're not that interested. And I think, you know, you make a fair point. You know, I suppose there wouldn't be that many people that bothered if I, you know, got attacked or whatever. And Nigel, he's obviously a much bigger fish than what I am. They're looking for clicks, you know they are. They're looking for views. They're looking for people to click on their social media. And it would appear, well, it feels like it anyway, that us that's supposedly to the right of politics will get less protection or less sympathy.
And do you think that this desire for clicks, this desire to demonise, this desire to show how righteous you are, could have tragic consequences?
It could, Martin. You know what the reporters like, the media in this country, like a bunch of piranhas in a pool, waiting for politicians like me and Nigel and Richard to be thrown in that pool and savaged or whatever. You know, they've got little sympathy for us. They're not very fair. You know this, Martin. You've seen how they report these things. Now, how much sympathy is out there on the mainstream media over this past 24 hours for Nigel Farage? Not very much. What would your message be to those journalists who seem to enjoy nothing more than whipping up a frenzy against people like Nigel? I would say, you know, journalists and politicians have a strained relationship. We are both necessary evils. We need each other. We do, Martin. That's just a fact of life. Just show a little bit more compassion, be a little bit kinder. OK, thank you very much. And there's kind words to say on this day of all. Thank you very much for joining us in the studio. Lee Anderson, it was a pleasure. Stay safe out there. Well, we can now speak with the friend of Sir David Amess and a friend of mine, Anne Widdecombe. Anne, welcome to the show. It's a terrible day to remember, but remember we should. Let's start, if we could, by perhaps you could share some of your memories of Sir David Amess, your friend.
Yes, indeed. He had a tremendous sense of humour, but he was a very, very dedicated member of Parliament, spent absolutely oodles of time in his constituency, was always dashing back to Westminster because he'd spent the day in the constituency, loved by people of all political persuasions in Southend. And, of course, I remember him as a very good colleague and as a very kind colleague. And significantly, I think that when we had his memorial service after the murder, there were many people present from other parties who were talking about how good he had been to them.
And I had Lee Anderson in the studio earlier on, Anne, and he was saying of all of the parliamentarians he met, he said David was so slight, so affable, so nice, the very, very last person you would ever imagine anything like this to happen to.
Indeed, but he happened to have voted a particular way on bombing Syria and therefore incurred the wrath of a fundamentalist. And, nobody would want to harm David. David was never worried about meeting constituents, never thought that anything like that would happen to him, nor did any of us think it would happen to him. And no, I mean, he was the last person who deserved it.
And Anne, that brings us on to the thorny topic of have any lessons been learned? And in fact, we seem to be living in an era of heightened concerns for parliamentarians, particularly perhaps in wake of October the 7th and the pro-Palestine movement. We've seen an uptick. We saw people outside Parliament, just over there, of course, trying to get into the place, intimidating parliamentarians within. We've seen even Labour MPs, even the leader of the opposition, as he was then, Sir Keir Starmer, being chased off a train in Scotland, Angela Rayner, a lot of Labour people too. But there seems to be this prevalence. MI5 told us last week, Anne, 75% of terror threats are still Islamist terror threats. And yesterday, you no doubt have seen the chilling death threat issued to Nigel Farage from what Lee Anderson called a creature. We don't know if this individual is still in France. We don't know if they're on British soil. Some people reckon he is. This TikToker called Madder Passer, he's got a machine gun tattooed on his face, issued a death threat to Nigel Farage. Nigel, I'm told, is very, very worried about his personal safety. And Anne Widdecombe, it just seems that the same problems are prevalent 3 years on to the day as they were on that day when David Amos was tragically killed.
Oh, yes, and I think they're almost certainly worse. I think the only thing that's changed is that MPs are much more alive to the threat and they do take things slightly more seriously. But I know something. I know that David would never have wanted his death to mean that MPs were less willing to mingle with their constituents. It's a crucial part of the job that you're out and about in your constituency. And yes, I know that Nigel and other MPs now have to have protection, which is a terrible comment on the age in which we live. But nevertheless, David would have wanted parliamentarians to be very much part of their constituency.
And yet, Anne Widdecombe, Nigel Farage has said before, he feels too afraid to do a constituency surgery meeting as David Amos did. He said he would be terrified of somebody coming in with a knife. The echoes of what happened to Sir David Amos and Nigel Farage being such a high-profile target, he's too afraid. So, yeah, of course, in principle, we would all like to be free and open. But is that now a forlorn memory? Are we in an age where that's simply too dangerous for high-profile people like Nigel?
Well, I think if you have protection and if constituents are willing to be searched, I don't mean, incredibly searched in detail, but for things like knives or guns. If constituents are willing to be searched and there is protection there, then I think that is a way to go forward. Every MP has to make their own individual decision. It's not something that can be dictated from on high. They've got to decide for themselves. I always took the line when I was an MP that, it was an occupational hazard, but it was nothing like it is today. I used to get death threats. We've all had death threats. You put them in the bin. I used to have them from people purporting to be from the IRA. And I used to say to my staff, well, don't be daft. The IRA doesn't give you warning. It just does it. So it doesn't come from the IRA. So you do have to be quite discerning about what is serious and what is not. But I think we have to look beyond individual MPs. We have to ask what we're doing as a state. And I'm very concerned about the Prevent programme. David Amos's murderer had a very fleeting acquaintance with the Prevent programme. And I think that anti-radicalisation measures are the way forward. But what, of course, we don't know now is that with people coming into this country who haven't been vetted, who haven't come in through the visa route, etc., we don't quite know what is there.
And Anne, could I ask you this? I had an extraordinary conversation last night on GB News with a human rights lawyer, this individual who's issued a chilling threat to Nigel Farage. He may be in France. And the human rights lawyer was saying, well, what we should do is get this individual to Britain, detain them in Britain. Anne Widdecombe, why should we import problems to this country if they've made death threats against our parliamentarians? Surely the answer is don't let them arrive in the first place.
Well, of course, I didn't hear what the human rights lawyers said, so I've got to be careful in any comment that I make. But what he may have been saying was that if France isn't doing anything about it, then we need to. I mean, all I know is that if somebody is making threats from another country, that country should deal with it. And I understand the argument that if they don't, we should. But on the whole, I'd rather they were over there.
Yeah, because, of course, if this guy who's an Afghani is brought into the country, we'd never be able to deport them, Anne Widdecombe, because that would contravene their human rights in case the Taliban were mean to them. And so we'd have a problem on our shores, yet another one. Anne Widdecombe, thank you for joining us. And thank you in particular for sharing your memories of Sir David Amess on this 3rd anniversary of his tragic killing. Thank you, Anne Widdecombe.